Grade 12 Economics. Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Mhlongo. I'm back here with you on the completion of macroeconomics. So today we are completing the foreign exchange markets that we covered last week. But we'll also, at the end of the lesson, just review our previous topics since we're writing next week, Friday, your control test. So we'll be reviewing the circular flow topic, business cycle, and the public sector. Please join me. Let's see what we have in the pocket for you. The following are the lesson objectives that will be achieved during the course of this lesson. So this lesson, after this lesson or during the course of this lesson, you will understand what is meant by the terms of trade. What is the importance of terms of trade? And then also, what is the benefit of having increased or declined the terms of trade? You will also learn more about the foreign exchange markets, which is the market where different world currencies are traded. We will talk about the establishment of foreign exchange markets, where we refer to different kinds of exchange rates. And then we'll talk about also in the graphical explanation of appreciation, depreciation, also giving you a broad explanation on revaluation and devaluation. Then we'll also discuss reasons for one to demand the foreign currency or one to supply the foreign currency. Then we'll be correcting we'll also be correcting overvalued currency as well as the undervalued currency. So this is the board of our lesson. We're starting with terms of trade, which refers to the index of export prices to the index of import prices. And then we'll discuss the foreign exchange markets. And then everything that will start here, or any lesson that will start here, we begin with the exam guideline. I will skip this one because last week this was covered as a part of exam guideline, at the part of what we call reasons for foreign trade as your essay. It was discussed last week. And then also the effects of foreign trade were also explained last week on our lesson. And then the balance of payments was also explained from the current account, capital transfer account, as well as financial account. It was explained or discussed last week. And then we also corrected balance of payment disequilibrium using all of these concepts here or items. Then our focus today is on the foreign exchange market. So it is very important for you to understand on your exam guideline that you have to know the concept relevant, such as the exchange rate, different types of exchange rate that include the free floating exchange rate, controlled or managed floating exchange rate, as well as the fixed exchange rate. Also another concept, appreciation, then depreciation, devaluation, and revaluation. And then foreign exchange control. Then also you must know the supply and the demand for what we call it, the foreign exchange. So factors affecting the demand, factors affecting the supply, you must know them. And then also exchange rate equilibrium. You must be able to draw the graph and interpret the graph. Then also changes in equilibrium, interpret the graph and draw. Briefly explain interventions in the market to correct overvalued or undervalued currency. That is very important for you to know as for today's lesson. And then we continue. Firstly, brief explain the following exchange rate systems, where we talk about the free floating, managed floating, or controlled floating, as well as the fixed. Also describe the terms of trade under the following headings. Description, you must be able to define or describe terms of trade, the formula, and the effects of terms of trade in the economy. That will be explained also in this lesson. So this is your examination guideline on the today's lesson. The rest will be a part of the revision. So the following are the concepts that are important for you to understand or grasp this lesson. The first one is absolute advantage. It was covered last week. Balance of payments was also covered. Comparative advantage was also covered. Direct investments were covered. Also exchange rate was covered. Then we'll continue to check also the free trade was covered. IMF was covered. The foreign trade was covered. Net balance was covered. Portfolio investment as well as special drawing rights were covered on our previous lesson. And then we continue to check. Then we are on terms of trade today. So it compares a country's export prices with its import prices. So when we talk about terms of trade, we simply compare prices for exported goods and price for imported goods, then we will be able to determine the terms of trade in there. So there's a formula where we say TOTs equals to index of export prices divided by index of import price multiplied by 100. Then you just substitute on the given import prices and the export prices. It is very important that you avoid making a mistake by taking your imports to be your numerator. Always your numerator will be export prices, denominator will be import prices multiplied by 100. So the terms of trade will improve when export prices increase. This will be discussed. So whenever export prices are increasing, terms of trade will be improving. If ever export prices are decreasing or import prices are increasing over export prices, terms of trade will be decreasing. The trade balance, the value of exports minus imports, then transfer payment, money received without any counter performance. And then we continue with terminologies. So exports, I think you are familiar with this one. These are goods produced locally and sold abroad. We call them exports. Import, goods produced abroad and sold locally. So we call it goods and services. Remember, exports can be physical or can be tangible or intangible. Can be physical, can be tangible, and also can be intangible. We have parts of exports that are physical or tangible that we spoke about last week. We have also invisible imports and exports on your current account. And then also appreciation is the increase in the value of the country's currency in relation to another due to market forces. That's an appreciation. Whenever the value of the currency increases compared to another currency because of market forces, we call that appreciation. Depreciation, the decrease in the value of the country's currency in relation to another due to market forces. Whenever the value of the country's currency decreases, for instance, the rand to the dollar, if the rand to the dollar decreases its value, we call that a depreciation. If ever the value of the rand increases against the dollar, we call that appreciation. And then we have devaluation, which is defined as a deliberate decrease in the value of the country's currency to make exports cheap. And then we have revaluation, which is defined as the deliberate intervention or deliberate increase in the value of the country's currency to make exports expensive. So as for devaluation and revaluation, there is no market intervention in there. Here, the government intervenes by influencing the currency. That's what we call a devaluation and revaluation. It will be discussed also. So the lesson starts here. We have terms of trade. So in here, you consider the following. We have export prices, then we have the import prices. So these two items are very important in order to determine our terms of trade, because should export prices increase, if they increase, what is going to happen? As export prices are increasing, that will mean our terms of trade will be increasing. As import prices increase more than export prices, our terms of trade will be declining. So it is very important also for you to discover what we call factors that influence terms of trade. So let's check. Let's say our currency is appreciating. So we'll say appreciation. Our currency is gaining the strength. Then as the currency appreciates, what is going to happen? The export prices will increase, and then import prices will decrease. And then exports will be then expensive. And then imports will be cheap. And then what is going to happen then? The terms of trade will be increasing. But as they increase in terms of, as terms of trade are increasing, they can mainly increase maybe in the short run, provided if our exports are demand elastic or demand inelastic. Should our exports be demand elastic, they can be replaced easily, meaning foreign countries can find substitutes for our exported goods and services as they become expensive, meaning in the long run, our terms of trade will decline if ever our export prices are increasing faster. And then we must also be aware of the fact that as our currency appreciates, maybe rand appreciates against the dollar depreciates. So if our exports are becoming expensive, what happens? Imports are becoming cheap, meaning domestic consumers might be demanding more imports, which will then affect our BOP. So that will be discussed also as we go on with the lesson. So this is the explanation. So terms of trade refer to the ratio or index of export prices to the ratio of import prices. So we say it's the ratio or the index of export prices and import prices. So we compare them. Those are the terms of trade. We compare the prices for exported goods and the prices for imported goods. What will influence those prices? They will be influenced by the level of inflation in South Africa. They will be influenced by the value of the currency appreciation and depreciation. So the change in both import and export prices affect terms of trade. So like I've mentioned before, if import prices are increasing faster than export prices, that will be causing what we call the decline in terms of trade. But if export prices are increasing faster than import prices, that will be causing the increase in terms of trade. Terms of trade are used to focus foreign trade and the country's international competitiveness. So the function or the importance of terms of trade is to measure competitiveness of domestic exports into the global market. So the main aim is to check how competitive are our exported goods in the foreign market. It only measures that. How do we see if our exports are competitive? We consider export prices. Should our export prices be increasing, that means our goods will be competitive abroad and will be earning more revenues in terms of foreign currencies as we export our goods and services. But should our export prices decrease abroad, that will simply mean our goods are less competitive because as a country will be receiving less earnings as payment for exports. Remember, if terms of trade increase, what happens? There will be increase in the national income as the inflow of foreign currencies come in, and then also there will be increase in economic growth, which will be improving the welfare of the nation. So it simply leads to welfare gain. But should our terms of trade decrease, that will lead to welfare loss because there will be decrease in the inflow of foreign currencies, decrease in national income, decrease in the growth of the economy, which will then lead to welfare loss. So as terms of trade change, they affect export earnings either negatively or positively. So now let's be specific. If ever they increase, export earnings will be increasing. If they decrease, export earnings will be decreasing. Then we continue. What is the effect of the increase in terms of trade or in export prices? So the improvement in terms of trade is caused by the increase in export prices and decrease in import price. Remember, these are working against each other. If export prices are increasing, import prices are decreasing. That means then we will be having more money received as payment for exports, which will be increasing our terms of trade. So the increase in this increases economic welfare because more revenues is earned with the same expenditure. So there will be more welfare because more revenues or more income will be received as payment for exports flowing into the country. So there will be increase in the welfare of the nation. In the long run, higher export prices may result to decrease in sales volumes depending on the price elasticity of demand, and therefore result in less income being generated by exports. Like I've mentioned, if our exports are demand elastic, that will mean they are simply replaceable. They contain substitute goods. So should they become expensive because of the increase in export prices, what is going to happen? There might be lower demand for our exported goods abroad. If the demand decreases because of expensive exports, that will mean now there will be less income received by South Africa as a part of what we call payment for exports. So that will be decreasing our terms of trade if our goods are easily replaceable in the foreign markets. However, should our goods not be having perfect substitutes abroad, they will keep on being demanded even if the prices are increasing. So you need to keep that in your mind that in the long run, terms of trade can decrease if ever export prices are increasing due to the fact that they might be demand elastic. But if that demand inelastic, the demand will keep on being high even if the price is increasing because they are not easily replaced. They don't contain perfect substitutes in the global or foreign market. So it is very important for you to note the impact or the effect of elasticity of demand on the terms of trade. Don't be confused whenever the examiner happens to ask you, what is the impact of elasticity of demand on what we call on terms of trade? You need to keep it in your mind that as export prices are increasing, we know that terms of trade will be increasing. However, should our exports be demand elastic, they might easily be replaced or substituted abroad or in the foreign market, which will lead to the decrease in demand and decrease in terms of trade. But if our exports are demand inelastic, even if our export prices are increasing, the demand will keep on rising because our exported goods are not having perfect substitutes in foreign markets. So a loss of welfare might then occur if ever we have what we call a decreased sales and decreased terms of trade. What about the decrease in import prices? So it's also increasing our terms of trade. The decrease in import prices is a greater incentive to local consumers as they pay less. So if import prices have been lowered, because maybe of the depreciation of that particular currency. What is going to happen? Domestic consumers will be favored because they will afford foreign produced goods and services at the lower cost. However, it is having a bad effect on balance of payment. Or a good effect, So if our import prices are decreasing, so there's a bad effect. Yeah, I'm correct. There's a bad effect. Should our import prices be decreasing, domestic consumers will be demanding most of imported goods and services over the locally produced goods and services. That will simply lead to imports increasing faster than exports in the global, in the domestic market, and that will lead to the trade deficit or current account deficit, because as imports exceed exports, that causes a deficit in the current account. However, it can depend also if, as much as the import prices are becoming more cheaper for us. How much is the outflow of domestic currency? How much is the inflow of foreign currencies? But basically, in general, we say as imports become cheap, imports will be increasing faster than exports in South African economy, which will be leading to current account deficit. So the increase, this increased welfare because expenditure on imports is less since they are cheap. So our domestic consumers normally spend less on imported goods if ever they're cheap, which increase their welfare because our consumers now will be affording more goods at the lower cost that are even produced abroad. Over the long run, welfare may be lost if cheap imports compete successfully with the locally produced goods and services. So now let's look at this. Should those imported goods compete effectively with our locally produced goods and services, the welfare will be lost, because what is going to happen? There will be these imports that are cheap will be driving out our local firms from the market, because as cheap imports flow in, that will mean consumers will be compromising from demanding locally produced goods and services and demand imports, which will then be fighting against our local firms and result to high level of unemployment, because more goods will be demanded from abroad over demanding the locally produced goods and services. This may decrease production locally and reduce welfare due to job losses and less production. So in South Africa, there will be job losses because our local industries won't be that much effective due to that particular unfair competition by imported goods and services. So that result to welfare loss also, because as people are losing their jobs, then they won't be having any income, which will be making it very difficult for domestic economy also, because less consumption will occur, less productivity will occur, less GDP will occur. So that lead to welfare loss because of what? Because of cheap imports flowing in to compete successfully with the locally produced goods and services. Then what if terms of trade are decreasing? So the decrease in terms of trade may be the result of changes in imports and export prices. So here we are talking about factors that can influence terms of trade, the import prices as well as export prices. Like I've mentioned before, that if ever import prices are increasing faster than export prices, terms of trade will be decreasing, meaning there will be less revenues or less income or less earnings received by the country as in terms of foreign currencies to pay for our exported goods and services. So as import price increase faster, that will mean the terms of trade will decrease, because if import prices are higher, exports are lower. That is caused by what? That is caused by the depreciation of our currency. If our currency depreciates, imports become cheap abroad. As they become cheap, there will be less earnings on imported goods and services, which will be affecting our terms of trade negatively. However, as our currency depreciates, the foreign currency that we are comparing as exchange rate to our currency will be appreciating, which will be increasing import prices, meaning that will be making it very expensive to import goods from the global market, which is also good for our BOP, because as imports are becoming expensive, domestic consumers might not be affording them. They will compromise them by demanding the locally produced goods and services. So if imports are becoming expensive because of the increase in import prices, terms of trade will increase for the foreign country. Our terms of trade will be decreasing. However, that is good for our BOP, because we might find local consumers not demanding imported goods, but demanding the locally produced goods and services, which will be good for us. Also, at the same time, as import prices increase, our export prices will be decreasing, meaning there will be greater demand for exported goods in the global market. So a decrease in export prices. Welfare is lost. Welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce bigger volume of export that were needed to compensate for the fall in prices. So it can happen that local firms produce using much revenues as they produce goods. However, but because of the decrease in export prices, then our goods will be sold at the lowest possible price abroad, which will lead to our local firms not in receiving more revenues or more income on exported goods because of the decrease increase in export prices. So it might be a greater loss for our local firms or exporters due to the fact that they produce at the higher cost. Right now, they have to sell their exports at the lower cost because of the decrease in export price. So it leads to what we call a welfare loss and also loss of profits. The increase in import prices, what is the effect of that? So welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce more units of export to finance what we call the higher cost of imports. So let's check. If ever import prices are increasing, the simple thing will be local firms will not be demanding most of imported goods, which will also result to a welfare loss for our consumers, because as they find it expensive to import goods, they will demand less, which will then be compromising their welfare, since their choices will be minimized due to the fact that they are not having enough income to afford imported goods because they are expensive. And then, if export prices rise relative to import prices, there has been improvement in the terms of trade. So as export prices are increasing faster than import prices, terms of trade will be increasing. And then a unit of export price relatively more imports in that case, because we receive more income on those earnings. And then generally, this leads to an improvement in living standard as imported goods appear cheaper to consumers. So as our goods become expensive, imports become cheaper. But it is very important for you to be versatile and be flexible when you analyze this, because these benefit BOP but affect terms of trade. So in this situation, as export prices are rising, that will mean our exports will be expensive. There will be more terms of trade in the short run. We receive more income in the short run. But in the long run, it might be lower if our exports are demand elastic, if they are simply replaceable. However, import prices will be lower. So our local consumers or domestic consumers will then afford more imports because they are relatively cheap. As they become cheap, we afford more, we demand more of imported goods, and then we neglect the locally produced goods and services. So that can lead to the fact that imports will rise faster than exports, which will also affect the BOP. So it is very important for you, if you analyze this, to check the terms of trade effect as well as the effect on the the balance of payments. If imports rise if import prices rise relative to export prices, there's been a decrease in the terms of trade. So if ever imports are increasing faster than exports in terms of pricing, that will decrease terms of trade. Generally, it leads to decline in living standard as foreign currency earnings are relatively lower and imported consumer goods are more expensive. So as consumers find it expensive, they will not be demanding more of imported goods, which will then result to them not affording, which will be welfare loss for them, because if they are not affording those imports, their living standard will be compromised, since they've maybe changed their lifestyle to import more goods to improve their standards of living. What is affecting terms of trade? Exchange rate. So whenever the exchange rate is appreciating and depreciating, that will affect TOTs. So let's check. A fall in the exchange rate reduces the terms of trade. So if ever our exchange rate depreciates, terms of trade will also be lowered because export prices will be lower. This is because a decline in exchange rate will make exports cheaper. So whenever the currency depreciates, exports will be cheap, like I've mentioned before. So an appreciation in the exchange rate improves terms of trade because export rise in price and imports become cheaper. So as our exports become expensive, there will be more money received for exported goods, meaning for the same expenditure, but we earn more revenues or more income, which will be improving our terms of trade. Competitiveness of firms. As our firms become more competitive abroad, that can increase terms of trade. Export prices will be affected by the cost of raw materials and productivity. So it will depend. Remember, cost of raw material will affect the firm to either produce more or produce less goods and services. We continue. Relative inflation rates in different countries. Higher inflation would cause at least temporary improvement in terms of trade, as export prices will be rising faster than import prices. So inflation also has an effect. If inflation rises in that particular country where we're exporting goods to, that will mean then in that case we'll be having rising terms of trade, because our export prices are also affected by the inflation rate. However, inflation is likely to cause depreciation in the exchange rate, which will cause the exports to fall in the price. So also with the inflation, that can cause also our currency to lose the value or depreciate. Appreciation of the currency as the currency becomes stronger. The appreciation of the currency makes exports more expensive and imports cheap, and then increase in terms of trade. this increases terms of trade. If our currency appreciates, terms of trade will be increasing. If our currency depreciates, terms of trade will be decreasing. So how do we calculate terms of trade? This is the formula. Terms of trade, or TOT, is equal to the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices multiplied by 100. That's our formula. Then we will substitute. So we have we have the table here indicating a year from year 1, 2, 3, and 4. So index of export prices, 102, 94, 92, 105. So you can see that our trend is increasing from year 1 to year 2. It's decreasing. 102 to 94 is a decrease, but 94 to 92 also remains as a decrease. And then from 92 to 105, then we have an increase in what we call export prices. What about import prices? So we can compare here import and exports. Export prices are more than import prices, so terms of trade will be a little bit higher. Import prices are lower than export. Export prices are lower than import prices. Then we will have terms of trade declining. And then export prices are lower than import prices. Terms of trade will also be declining. Export prices are bigger than what we call import prices. Terms of trade will then be increasing in this case. So let's check the calculation of terms of trade now. So index of export prices divided by index of import price multiplied by 100. We have 102 over 98 times 100. We get 104. So that's the first one, which is year 1. And then year number 2, we substitute again. 94 over 100 multiplied by 100 goes to 94. Like I've mentioned to you, that if ever import prices are increasing faster than export prices, our terms of trade will then be declining. You can see that now this indicates the decline of what we call terms of trade from 104 to 94. They decreased by 10. And then let's check year number 3. So in year number 3, we have 92 over 99, meaning export prices are still lower because export prices are 92 while imports are 99. That is decreasing our terms of trade even further because import prices are higher than export prices. And then year number 4, we have 105 export prices and 103 import prices. Then terms of trade will be rising from 93 to what? To 102. So in this situation, our TOTs are increasing because export prices were higher than import prices. Export prices were 105 while import prices were 102. This increases our TOT. So it is very important for you to know that as our export prices are increasing more than import prices, terms of trade increase. But if import prices increase more than export prices, terms of trade will decrease. What is causing that? That is caused by maybe the appreciation of the currency and the depreciation of the currency. Should our currency appreciate, what is going to happen? Our export price will be rising faster than import prices. That will lead to the increase in terms of trade, basically in the short run, depending if our exports are demand elastic in the short run only then. But if they are demand inelastic, they will be rising both in the short run and long run. But should our currency depreciate, what is going to happen? Then our terms of trade will be decreasing because our export prices will be decreasing while import prices are increasing. That will be causing the decrease in terms of trade. So here is the table. Firstly, you compare 102 as export prices, 98 import prices, 104 is our terms of trade. From then we experience a decline because export prices are lower than import prices. So in this case, we have this situation. So that means terms of trade declined because import prices were higher than export prices. It gave us 94. And then year number 3, export prices decreased even further. They went from 94 to 92, while import prices slightly decreased but to 99. So in that case, we have terms of trade also being affected in that case because our import prices are bigger than export prices. It gives us 93. And then going down, our export prices are higher than import prices. So that's why terms of trade are now increasing from 93 to 102. So keep that in your mind. The factors that will affect the terms of trade is export prices, import prices, appreciation, depreciation, the inflation, and the competitiveness of local businesses in the global market. Then we move to the foreign exchange market. So we are comparing both now appreciation and depreciation. Remember, here now we are all about currencies now. So let's check. We have appreciation, we have revaluation. So this is all under what we call the foreign exchange market. So we have something that we call the excess supply. How do we see appreciation? For our currency to appreciate or to be stronger, we must have the excess supply of our domestic currency. There must be more supply of our domestic currency than the demand for our domestic currency. So excess supply will lead to an appreciation. How will you see that graphically? The supply must be increasing more than the demand. That will be giving you the appreciation of the currency. So let's check. That is under foreign exchange market. So we have appreciation, revaluation. How do we see revaluation? Mainly revaluation is about the direct intervention or deliberate intervention by increasing what we call the value of the currency to make our exports expensive. So that's when the state is not using the free floating exchange rate. It might be using a fixed exchange rate, then it is influencing the exchange rate in a direct manner. So exchange rate is known as the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. We call that one an exchange rate. Exchange rate determines the value of different world currencies. So we compare different currencies in this case. We can say a rand to the dollar. Maybe a rand to the dollar is 19 rand 90 to $1. And then maybe a rand to the pound is 24 rand 50. And meaning we spend 24 rand 50 to afford a single pound. A rand to the euro is 21 rand 90. So meaning we spend 21 rand to afford a single euro. That's what we call an exchange rate. So world countries use different exchange rate systems, which include the free floating exchange rate, it will be discussed, the controlled or managed floating exchange rate, as well as the fixed exchange rate. So, but South Africa is using the free floating exchange rate. Each country is responsible for choosing exchange rate system that suits its economic conditions. So the country have a choice. It chooses one of the three that is suitable for its economic conditions. Then we continue. So exchange rate systems, firstly, we have the fixed exchange rate, free floating, and the managed or controlled floating exchange rate. So they will be discussed briefly so that you know how to give the difference between them all. Now we talk about the free floating exchange rate. So this is the exchange rate system that can appreciate and depreciate without limit. This is the exchange rate system that occurs or exists where there are market forces or demand and supply that can only influence the currency. The value of the currency is not determined by anyone, but the value of the currency is determined by market forces, demand and supply. Even though there can be intervention, but that intervention will be indirect, whereby Reserve Bank will intervene by influencing interest rates so that it can affect the value of the currency. So it is the system where the equilibrium exchange rate is determined by the forces of the demand and supply without any intervention by the government. So keep it in your mind, under free floating exchange rate, there is no government intervention. Only market forces can intervene to affect the value of the currency. Any equilibrium on the exchange rate is determined by market forces, demand and supply without any government interference. This system is generally works automatically. There is no direct control on it, but market forces are the one that will be determining the value of the exchange rate or the value of the currency compared to other currencies. This equilibrium is automatically corrected, so no one simply intervene manually to affect it, but it's automatically corrected by market conditions, which are the demand and supply. The central banks have a little control over it, and as a result, they prefer not to interfere. So the central bank can indeed interfere by influencing the exchange rate through maybe changing the interest rate to influence the demand and the supply for the domestic currency. South Africa has had the free floating exchange rate since year 2002. So South Africa used this exchange rate system since year 2002, but before it was using the controlled or managed floating exchange rate. So it is very important for you to know this one. So we move to the managed. So you have to be able to draw the difference between the free floating exchange rate and the managed floating exchange rate. What about this one? So this is the exchange rate system that its value is determined by market forces. However, the minimum and maximum limits are predetermined by the government. So two parties are involved in here to determine this value of the currency. Market forces will allow it to fluctuate or to appreciate and depreciate, but there are some predetermined limitations that are set by the government. For instance, the state can say the South African rand to the dollar can only be stronger, if it's very much stronger, it will be up to 7 rand to a single dollar. If it's the weakest, it can be up to 12 rand to the single dollar. Meaning, as our currency appreciates, it cannot appreciate beyond 6 rand to the dollar, cannot depreciate beyond 12 rand to the dollar. So those are limitations. 12 and 6 are limits, meaning that the currency cannot be weaker beyond 12 rand, cannot be stronger beyond what we call beyond 6 rand. So then it can move up and down between 6 rand, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 to 11.99, cannot go above 12. So that means now it's a controlled floating. It is indeed floating, but under controlled conditions. Limitations have been set. They've been predetermined by the government. That's why I'm saying to you, the value of this currency is determined by market forces as for moving up and down. However, the maximum limits are set by the government. The minimum limits are set by the government. So in this case, both parties are involved. So that's why we say the value of the exchange rate may respond to the influences of the market forces within certain predetermined limits. Before these limits are reached, the monetary authority intervenes by buying or selling foreign exchange, thus influencing the demand or supply of the foreign exchange. Big suppliers of forex are needed for such intervention. And then we move to, we continue with this one. Intervention will result to the appreciation or depreciation of the currency. If ever there's any intervention, there can be appreciation or depreciation. For example, central bank can increase the supply of domestic currency by buying other currencies. Because of the increase in supply, the price of the domestic currency will decrease, so depreciation. So from 1979 to 2002, South Africa used the managed floating exchange rate system from 1979 to the beginning of 2002. From then, South Africa moved to the free floating exchange rate. So now it's important for you to check the following. If you have to differentiate between free floating and the managed floating, who determines the value of the currency under free floating? It's market forces, demand and supply only. Who determines the value they cite under managed or floating exchange rate? That one is determined by market forces. However, the limitations are set by the government. So now you can see the difference. And then the common thing here is that they can both appreciate and depreciate. However, free floating can appreciate and depreciate unlimitedly, but the managed floating can appreciate and depreciate within predetermined minimum and maximum limits. What about the fixed exchange rate? Is totally different now. A fixed exchange rate system means that the value of the currency is fixed or pegged for a certain period of time. So until 1971, the value of such currencies was fixed in terms of amount of gold backing the standard of money unit. So in this situation, we are saying until 1971, countries were using this kind of what you call exchange rate, which was then backed by the gold. If the country had more gold or more monetized gold, the country used to have the stronger currency because the currencies were backed by gold by then. Since then, the values has been fixed in terms of US dollar. Examples are China and the Saudi Arabia currencies. The central bank must buy or sell currency to maintain the exchange rate at the set level. So that's when the state intervened by setting the currency to remain at the certain level for the certain period of time. In order to avoid uncertainties of the continuously changing exchange rate, government usually peg their rates at the undervalued levels to avoid running out of the foreign exchange reserves. When reserves become low, they devalue their currency. When reserves become too high, they cause inflation. They revalue their currency. Government can devaluate the exchange rate by fixing it at the lower level or revaluate by fixing it at the higher level. Before 1979, South Africa used the fixed exchange rate system, meaning it was pegged, remaining constant for the given period of time because of the state intervention. Now we check appreciation. What is meant by the appreciation? So the appreciation gives the strength of value to the currency as compared to an alternative currency. Remember, appreciation refers to the increase in the value of the currency in relation to another currency because of the market forces. So if two currencies are compared, the appreciation of one currency means the depreciation of another currency. So if you compare the rand to the dollar, if our rand appreciates against the dollar will be depreciating against the rand. There is no simultaneous appreciation. As one goes up, one goes down. They don't go approach the same direction as for appreciation. if they are compared to one another. In comparison, as one currency gains the strength, alternative currency loses the strength. Meaning, we say if ever the currency appreciates, it's gaining the strength. If the currency depreciates, it's losing the strength. If ever it appreciates, it gains the value. If it depreciates, it loses the value. So appreciation of the currency is good for exports and bad for imports. So why we are saying that? As the currency appreciates, what will be happening? Our exports will be becoming expensive abroad, meaning there will be more earnings received on exported goods and services. But imports will then be becoming cheap. So that will mean even if they are produced at the higher cost, they will be sold at the lower cost because of the depreciation of the currency. However, how does that affect the balance of payment? If currency appreciates, there must be a lower demand for our exports abroad because they become expensive. For that reason, there might be lower demand for exported goods, which will then result to imports increasing faster than exports. Appreciation is caused by excess supply and the decline in the demand for the currency in the foreign exchange market. The effects of appreciation: as the currency appreciates, exports become expensive comparative in foreign markets. So as our goods are sold abroad, then our exports will be expensive. So they become competitive in the global market as they bring us more foreign earnings. That will be increasing our terms of trade also. Expensive export has a short-run effect on increasing export earnings. So the short-run effect is explained in the situation. As our exports are becoming expensive, there might be more earnings received on exports. However, if our exports are demand elastic, they can be replaced easily abroad, which will be decreasing the demand for our exports. This increased terms of trade and welfare gain for the country in the short run. The long-run effect of appreciation is the decrease in demand for export, depending on the price elasticity of demand for exported goods and services. That has been explained several times. Effects of appreciation continue. This can result to the decrease in production of goods and services locally and decrease our country's GDP because goods are not highly demanded abroad due to the fact that they are expensive. Appreciation has an effect of increasing trade deficit and stretches current account deficit because imports become cheaper as exports become expensive. So if the currency appreciates, exports will be expensive abroad, meaning there will be less demand for exported goods, and imports become cheaper because as our currency become expensive, again that particular currency, our imports, the imports will be cheaper. So there might be more demand for imports and less demand for exports, meaning imports will increase faster than exports, which might cause what we call the current account deficit. These benefit local consumers as they get to choose from the wide range of imported goods and served at the lower cost while comparing to local products. So foreign goods that are imported will become relatively cheap for local consumers, which will lead to the greater demand for imported goods, that will be benefiting our local consumers, that will be increasing also the welfare for local consumers. If this is persistent, local firms might be more vulnerable, which can shut down our domestic businesses. So this is the graph that indicates what we call the appreciation. Remember, I said there will be excess supply. So check. Originally, we have our supply and the demand. Remember, rand to the dollar, and then the quantity of what we call of our rent. So originally in this point, this is the equilibrium point where the supply for the rent equal to the demand. And then we say we pay 15 rand to afford a single dollar at Q. And then as our currency appreciates, what is happening? There's a greater supply for South African rents. You can see now the excess supply happening there. The supply moved from S to S1 for our rents. And then what happens? Then our currency appreciates from 15 to 12, meaning we are spending now 15 rand to afford a single dollar. Remember, here we use indirect approach, not a direct approach. Indirect approach will mean as our currency move from higher number to the lower number against the foreign currency, we call that an appreciation. But if it's moved from lower number to higher number, we call that a depreciation. We use an indirect approach to deal with currencies in this situation. And then we explain the graph. Originally, S is supply curve and D is the demand curve. E is original equilibrium point, and then 15 rand is the original value of the rand. Q is the original quantity demanded and supplied. There you see those are original points. And then what happens after? the supply of rands increased from S to S1. You can see increasing from S to S1, meaning the rand is supplied higher than the demand. In that case, what is going to happen? The demand remained unchanged. It did not change. It remains at D. So let's check what happens after the quantity of rand supplied increased to Q1. You can see Q1, while the value of the rand appreciates from 15 to 12. We call this one appreciation because in this situation, we're paying 15 rand to afford a single dollar, but now we're paying 12 rand. That means our rand is now stronger as we afford more dollars with the 15, as we pay 12 rand. So you check for you to see if ever the currency favors you or not favors you. You take that currency, you take the amount of money you might be having. Maybe you say you have 5,000 rand, divide by 15. And then how many currencies or in terms of dollars will you afford? And then you take the same 5,000 rand that you are having, divide by 12. How many currencies will you afford? Obviously, 5,000 rand will give you more US dollars. Then that means your currency is stronger in that situation because you can afford more of US dollars. So excess supply of rands occurs because the supply for the rands increases more than the demand of the rands. And then appreciation graph. So let's check the change in demand now. Remember, the supply was increasing more than the demand. Now we have the demand decreasing, which keep the supply remaining high. How do we see that? Original point is supply, original point is demand. E is original equilibrium. Then we have our Q, meaning originally our rand to the dollar is 18 rand. To afford a single dollar, we have to pay 18 rand. But then what happens now? The demand for South African rands decline from D to D1. As it declines from D to D1, the supply remains high now because supply remains at Q, meaning it's still supplied at the higher level, but the demand is declining. In that situation, that will lead to excess supply because the supply for the rand remains higher while the demand for the rand is now lower than what is supplied. Then our currency then appreciates from 18 rand to 11 rand. We are now paying 11 rands to afford a single dollar, while before we were paying 18 rand. This is known as an appreciation because our currency or the rand has gained the strength. We can afford more of US dollars by paying lesser amount of money. We call this appreciation. Remember, an indirect approach is used. So let's explain the graph. So this is the original point that have been explained, whereas the original supply curve, the original demand curve. And then as for the equilibrium, we are trading, we are paying 18 rand to afford a single dollar at Q, and then the supply remains constant, but the demand is declining. Let's check. The demand for rand decreased from D to D1 while the supply remains unchanged. You can see on the graph it's not changing. Quantity of rands demanded decreased from, to Q1, meaning now they are demanding less of South African rands while the value of rands appreciate from 18 to 11 rand. Now we have to pay 11 rand to afford a single dollar, which becomes more cheaper for us as South Africans. That means our rand has gained the strength. You must be careful on this one because this is very much tactical. You must understand. Avoid using a direct approach whenever you deal with appreciation and depreciation numerically, and also understand that for the rand to appreciate, there must be excess supply of rand, meaning the rand must be supplied more than it's demanded. Then you can have what we call an appreciation. What about revaluation? It's related to appreciation. Revaluation is a direct intervention by the central bank to positively influence the currency of the country to make exports expensive. That's when states intervene deliberately to influence the value of the currency. This is done as a mechanism to increase export earnings and the welfare gain. So they try to make exports more expensive so that there will be more earnings on exported goods and services. That can also result to the increase in terms of trade. Depreciated a local currency makes export too cheap and result to them selling at the lower cost, below the cost of production. Therefore, it is important for the state to intervene by influencing the value of the currency through what we call a revaluation. Revaluation gives the value to local currency while making imports more expensive. That will be favoring our domestic consumers, our domestic economy, but not favoring our consumers because as imports become expensive, domestic consumers will not be affording imported goods. But local firms will find it very easy to compete because imports are expensive while local produced goods and services are not that much expensive. So domestic consumers will then be demanding the locally produced goods and services over imported goods because of what? Because of that particular intervention. What about depreciation and devaluation? So let's check. We have depreciation, devaluation. So for depreciation to occur, there must be excess demand. So meaning our currency must be highly demanded than being supplied. That will be causing devaluation. However, as for devaluation, that's when the state intervenes deliberately to influence the value of the currency or to decrease the value of the currency to make exports cheap. And then this is under foreign exchange market. So it is very important for you to note that the exchange rate stability that we spoke about under public sector objectives is important here. We don't like the current that is too strong. We don't like the current that is too weak, because that results to what we call instability. It does not support our economic activities. We need the current that is stable in a way that it supports our economic activities. Too strong currency is bad because it might lead to our export becoming too expensive abroad in a way that there will be lower demand for them, resulting to less productivity within the country. And then too weak currency is also bad for the nation because it results to our export becoming too cheap and selling at the lower cost than the cost of production. So it is important for us to obtain exchange rate stability as a country. So what is meant by depreciation? So that's when the value of the currency has been weakened. So the value of the currency is weaker compared to the alternating currency. So we call this one the decrease in the value of the currency in relation to another currency because of market forces. If two currencies are compared, the appreciation of one currency means the depreciation of another currency. We know, I've explained that. So as the one currency depreciates, the alternating currency will be appreciating. In comparison, as one currency gains the strength, another currency will be losing the strength. As one currency loses the strength, another currency will be gaining the strength. Depreciation of the currency is bad for exports and good for imports. What does that mean? So as our currency becomes, or as our currency depreciates, it loses the value. What then happens? Exports become cheap. Exporters will find it difficult to get more earnings because exports then will become cheap abroad since there will be less earnings received on them. However, there will be more demand for exported goods, but there will be less earnings for them. And then let's check. Imports will become expensive. So if our currency depreciates, what is going to happen? Exports will be cheap, imports will be expensive. Then what will happen? Then as imports become expensive, that will demand less imports as a country because they are now expensive. We look in that angle only. Then depreciation is caused by excess demand and the decline in supply for the domestic currency in the foreign exchange market. Whenever there's an excess demand for our currency and less supply for it, that will cause what we call a depreciation. What are the effects of depreciation? As the currency depreciates, exports become cheap and then less competitive in other ways, meaning there will be less earnings on exported goods and services in the foreign market because the currency has depreciated. Cheap imports has a short-run effect on increasing import earnings. So let's check. So as our currency, as our currency depreciates, our exports will be cheap. Those are exports that will become cheap. Then there might be more demand for our exports. However, the prices might be decreasing more than the cost of production, which will be bad for our domestic firms. So it is important to know that as exports are becoming cheap, are we earning more earnings on them? No, we might earn less because if our currency becomes too weak, then the goods might be more cheaper than the cost of production, which will be devastating our local firms or our local produced goods and services abroad. This decreases terms of trade welfare gain of the country. And then in the long run effect of depreciation is the decrease in demand for what we call for imports, depending on the price elasticity for imported goods and services. So remember, as our exports become cheap, imports become expensive. As domestic consumers, we compromise imported goods by demanding locally produced goods and services. So this is very tactical. You look at different angles. Appreciation is good, but can be bad also. Depreciation is bad, but one side can be good also because there can be more demand for our exported goods. However, depending if our earnings are declining beyond the cost of production, then there will be a problem. So as you analyze this, it is important to note the BOP effect and terms of trade effect. Then you will be able to get two different versions of answers, being good and bad in that case. The graph that indicates depreciation. So you can see that you have your supply as original, the demand as original, your quantity as QE, and then we have 10. So if our currency depreciates, the demand for our South African rand has increased from D to D1, but the supply remains constant and at S. So the quantity demanded goes to Q1, while the quantity supplied remains at Q. In that case, our currency loses the value. You can see we're paying 10 rand to afford a single dollar. But now we are paying 17 rand to afford a single dollar. That simply means now our currency has lost the value because the dollar becomes more expensive as our currency depreciates. That is caused by the excess demand. Our currency is highly demanded than supplied in the global market. This is the graph now. It comes in. Let's check the explanation. Original points are indicated. S is the original supply, D original demand, and then originally we are paying 10 rand to afford a single dollar at Q, and then the value of rand, and then we have originally what we call original quantity. That is basically Q in there, and then the demand for rands increases from D to D1. There you see the demand goes from D to D1, and then the supply remains constant at S, and then from then the quantity of rands demanded increase to 6, which is Q1 in this case. It increases to Q1, it's demanded, while the quantity supplied remains at Q. For that reason, the rand depreciates from 10 to 17. We're paying 10 rand to afford a single dollar, but now we're paying 17 rand, which is now expensive for us. Then the rand has depreciated because of the excess demand. It's highly demanded in the global market than being supplied by us as we demand foreign currencies. Then this is the change in supply. How can the currency depreciate whenever the supply is changing? The first one was the change in demand. Now there's a change in supply. Let's check. Originally we have S, and then we have D, original point here, and then originally we have 13 rand that we are paying to afford a single dollar at Q. However, as the supply of the rand decreases from S to S1, you can see we are supplying less of our rands now. What will happen? The demand for the rand remain high at Q. It remains being more than what is supplied at Q1. That will be leading to the depreciation, because as we are paying 13 rand to afford a single dollar at Q, now we have to pay 16 rand to afford a single dollar at Q1, which is known as also excess demand, because the demand for our currency remains high while the supply it remains high while the supply remains lower, because this indicates the decrease in the quantity of rand supplied as the supply changes from S to S1, meaning less supply for rand and more demand at Q, which it will be leading to the depreciation of our currency caused by the decrease in the supply for our South African rand. And then the graph is being explained here. Original points are explained here, and then we're paying 13 rands, you can see, and then now we're then paying what we call, we are now paying 16 rands. The supply of rands decreases from S to S1 while the demand remains unchanged. So quantity of rands supplied is increasing now. It's decreasing to 6, meaning that was Q, now is Q1. It's decreasing to 6 now, and then the value of the rand depreciates from 13 to 16. We used to pay 13 rand to afford a single dollar, but now we are paying 16 rand to afford a dollar. That is called the excess demand. It results to the depreciation of the currency. Our currency loses the value or the strength, meaning we afford less of the foreign currency in this situation because our currency is depreciating. And then let's check devaluation. So a devaluation is a direct intervention or deliberate intervention by the central bank by negatively influencing the currency of the country to make exports cheap. So what happens? The central bank intervenes. If ever our currency is too strong, that means it's overvalued. The state can intervene through what we call a devaluation, by doing what? By influencing the value of the currency to be weaker than before, so that our currency, our goods and services that are exported can be relatively what we call cheap if they are too expensive. Remember, if our exports are too expensive, there will be lower global demand. So it is important for the exchange rate to be stable so that our goods can also be demanded abroad. Remember, I mentioned that it is important to have exchange rate stability than having overvalued currency and undervalued currency. If it's overvalued, that means there will be less demand for our goods abroad, which will then lead to our locally produced goods to be less competitive abroad. If it's undervalued, that's also bad for the nation, because that will mean our goods will be sold at the lower cost than the cost of production, which is bad for our domestic firms in the global market. This is done as a mechanism to increase the demand for exports to positively influence the BOP. It is important to ensure that our level of exports are highly demanded so that our BOP can be influenced positively, so that exports can surpass or exceed imported goods and services. Appreciated local currency makes export expensive and result to the decline in their demand. So if ever our currency is strong or appreciated, exports will be expensive, then there might be a decrease in the demand for those goods. So that's when the state intervene by devaluing the currency through devaluation to make our export affordable so that our local firms can experience the better situation in the global market, whereby our goods can then be demanded compared to when our goods are not demanded abroad due to the fact that they are cost effective or expensive. What are the effects of overvalued currency? So if ever currency is overvalued, that means it is stronger than expected. What can be the best example? Maybe if it's overvalued, you find that the rand to the dollar, the rand is costing 8 rand to the single dollar instead of costing 15 rand to the single dollar. That currency is overvalued. It doesn't favor our economic conditions. Why that becomes the situation? It can be good for our terms of trade. However, exports become too expensive in a way that the global demand will be declining, which will hamper what we call the BOP, because as exports become expensive too much, that will lead to foreign consumers not demanding most of exported goods and services. So that's when the currency is overvalued. It's bad for the economy on another angle. It can be good for the economy on another angle. So that must be corrected to ensure the what we call stability on the exchange rate. It is important for the currency not to be overvalued in order to increase the level of export. Remember, it is very important to note that if goods are becoming expensive abroad, foreign consumers might find perfect substitutes for them and not demand our exports, which will then be bad for the BOP. Overvalued currency decrease the demand for SA export in the global market. So this decrease local productivity, decrease employment, and also decrease GDP of the country. As our goods are becoming too expensive abroad, they won't be highly demanded, which will be decreasing our productivity, GDP, as well as economic growth. Then foreign earnings of assets will then increase because our currency is strong. As we have those assets, our earnings will be increasing. However, then we'll have a problem of the BOP. So earnings on liabilities will be decreasing. We remember when we spoke about assets and liabilities. So liabilities earnings will be decreasing because their currency is lower in South Africa compared to the rand. Ours is stronger compared to them. So assets earnings will be increasing abroad. Liabilities in South Africa will be decreasing. In that case, we talk about capital transfer account as well as the financial account. However, BOP will be affected negatively in that case because our currency will be too strong, meaning there will be lower demand for what? There will be lower demand for our exported goods and services due to the fact that they are expensive. Should they be substituted easily, or should they have perfect substitute abroad? Correcting overvalued currency. South African Reserve Bank can intervene by increasing terms of, what we call interest rate to attract more investments. So if ever interest rate has been increased, what is going to happen? The foreign portfolio investors that are investing on buying shares will invest mostly in South African economy. As they invest the most, they demand our currency. So as they demand our rand, while it's not highly supplied, the rand will be losing its value because of high global demand. That will then lead to the currency losing its strength because it was overvalued. So by increasing interest rate, that attract foreign portfolio investors to invest most because as interest rate is increasing, they are attracted to buy more shares because they know that will be giving them more returns in South African economy. So interest rate will be increasing. Foreign investment on shares will increase. Excess demand for the rand will be increasing. The supply for the rand remains unchanged. Then the rand will be depreciating, meaning the value will be lost while the rand was too strong. You must be careful of this also. I'm using chain of events now to make you understand easily. South African Reserve Bank can directly intervene through devaluation. The demand for export will be increasing if ever the currency, the South African Reserve Bank devaluate the currency. So to devaluate means to devalue. We are removing the value on the currency. To revaluate is to give more value on the currency. South African Reserve Bank can also relax exchange rate control. Remember, the Reserve Bank has a responsibility to tighten exchange rate control policies so that whoever that is in demand of the foreign exchange can apply from the Reserve Bank to get the foreign exchange. However, in this situation, Reserve Bank can relax those regulations so that whoever that is in need of the domestic currency can access it without any regulation, so that our currency can be highly demanded and be accessible. That can also result to the increase in demand for rand. The government decreased the import restrictions. The demand for South African rand can be, will increase by importers. Demand for rand will exceed the supply of rand. Then the currency will depreciate. If the government want to devalue the currency, that's when the government intervene by relaxing import control policies so that there will be more demand for South African rand as people are importing goods and services. So importers will be demanding more South African rand. For that reason, that's when there will be more demand for what we call the South African rand than the supply, which will be depreciating our domestic currency. And then benefit of stable currency. So creates greater environment for domestic exporters. Local consumers can simply export easily and get more earnings because our exports will be highly demanded abroad. Stimulate capital formation by local industries. If our currency is stable, that will mean local firms will find it more easier to import capital goods from the global market so that they can be able to produce more goods and services. And then increase foreign earnings on domestic investments. There will be more demand for our exported goods, which will be increasing also more earnings. But should our currency be unstable, be maybe too stronger, that will mean now there might be lesser demand for exported goods because they will be too expensive abroad. Decrease the cost push inflation. As our currency is stable compared to other currencies, there might be less cost push inflation because our exchange rate won't be too weak compared to other currencies. So as firms are importing capital goods, those machines won't be too expensive, which will be causing less cost push. But should the currency be too weaker, that will cause cost push inflation because as we import machines at the higher cost, we will be producing at the higher cost and sell at the higher cost. That will be causing the cost push inflation. Increase local investment into the foreign market. That will allow local firms to invest easily into the global market because we can afford more of their currencies abroad. And then this is the assessment now. And then let's check what is being assessed. So we assess based on what has been covered. Study the graph below and answer questions that follow. Exchange rate. The rand is at the mercy of the market. So let's check in this situation. We have original demand, original supply. And then also everything started zero here. We have the rand to the dollar. We have quantity of US dollars, then the price of US dollars in rands. So you can see that the demand has increased from D to D1. So this is regarded to be excess demand because the supply remains unchanged at S, but the demand is increasing. What is happening here? We see the depreciation of the rand from 13 rand to 14 rand, meaning we have to pay more to afford the single dollar. Let's check here now. The questions are, identify the exchange rate system depicted in the graph. Obviously, it will be free floating. What was the original rand to the dollar exchange rate before the demand for US dollars increased? Then you can see that it was 13 rand. Briefly describe the term exchange rate, the value of one country's currency in relation to another country's currency. How has the increase in the demand for US dollars affected the value of rand? Then what could the Reserve Bank do to strengthen the value of the rand against the dollar? So let's check. So firstly, identify the exchange rate system depicted in the graph above. And then let's check the answer. There we go. It's a free floating exchange rate. And then what was the original rand to the dollar in exchange rate before the demand for US dollars increased? It was 13 rand mentioned before. We continue. Let's check the question. Briefly describe the term exchange rate. So we define this one as the rate of which one currency is exchanged to another, or the value of one country's currency in terms of another country's currency. And then we continue. How has the increase in the demand for US dollars affected the value of the rand? The value of the rand has depreciated from 13 rand to 14 rand against the dollar, or depreciated by 1 rand, meaning now it's been weakened because we pay 1 rand more to afford a single dollar. And then what could the Reserve Bank do to strengthen the value of the rand against the dollar? Reserve Bank could strengthen the value of the rand by selling US dollars in the reserve in the foreign exchange market to create an oversupply, selling the gold reserve on the international market to create the oversupply. And then also we continue obtaining assistance financial from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, to increase its inflow of foreign exchange, increasing repo rate to stimulate investment by foreigners in the South African economy. And then we continue another data response. Study the graph below and answer questions that follow. This is original demand. We can see supply is changing now two ways. It is increasing, it is also decreasing. You can see your original equilibrium at E, that is E1, the increase in supply which causes appreciation, the decrease in supply which causes depreciation. Then which supply curve indicate the decrease in the supply for US dollars? And then what type of the exchange rate system currently used in South Africa? Explain the term exchange rate. State one factor that could have led to the increase in the supply for dollars. Use the above graph to explain the effect of the increase in the supply for US dollars on the rand to US dollar exchange rate. 4 marks. Then that is data response for 10 marks. So let's check. Which supply curve that is indicate the decrease, that is S2. That is our S2. Then what type of exchange rate is currently used in South Africa? That's a free floating exchange rate. And then briefly describe the term, what we call devaluation. So let's just go back. I want to check something on the previous slide. So here, the definition is devaluation for the point of correction. And then let's check. Then done with this one. So briefly describe the concept devaluation. Devaluation is the deliberate decrease in the value of the currency by the central bank. So the aim is to make exports what we call cheap. State one fact that could have led to the increase in the supply for dollars, increase in the number of US tourists visiting South Africa, increase in the foreign direct investment from US to South Africa. Maybe also there are so many factors that can influence the supply of US dollars to South Africa. Maybe they are paying dividends for South African portfolio investors. Maybe also they are touring to South Africa. There are so many factors. How can weak South African rand affect terms of trade? So depreciated South African rand makes South African export more affordable in the foreign markets, which will increase the demand. The decrease in the export prices lower the terms of trade, resulting to the export earnings decreasing. And then we continue. We move to terms of trade. Now here we are given terms of trade for 2018 up to 2021. So index of import prices 141, 153, 163, 179. So the trend is increasing here. And then index of export prices 171, 191, 200, 204. The trend is increasing. Now you need to check. Here 141 are the import prices, 171 exports. So export prices are more than import prices. 2019, 153, 191. Export prices are still more, so meaning we have more terms of trade that they will be increased. And then 2020, 163, 200. Terms of trade are also increasing because export prices are still more than import prices. 179, 214. Still, there is an increase here. So let's check 179 to what we call 119. So let's check. There was a decrease, 122.7 to 119.6. So we need to calculate A there to see what is happening. So which institution provide the information? SARB. What is the trend of import prices? There is an increasing trend, by the way. You can see they've been increasing. And then briefly describe the terms of trade, the index of import to the index of export prices. What impact will the increase in terms of trade have on South African welfare? Whenever terms of trade are increasing, so there will be the welfare gain, because that will lead to more inflow of the foreign currencies and then more national income and economic growth. There will be more jobs being created in South African economy, which will be increasing income for the people. There will be welfare gain. Calculate terms of trade for 2019 here. This is 2019. Show all calculations. Then we use the formula. Let's check now answers here. The institution is South African Reserve Bank. There's increasing trend or upward trend or positive trend. And then in terms of trade, refer to the index or the ratio of export prices to the ratio of import prices. So those are your first answers for what we call for 4 marks. Then what impact will the increase in terms of trade have on South African welfare? The increase in terms of trade will result to increase in countries' foreign earnings, which can increase national income. Then what happens after? The increase in national income increases countries' social and economic welfare, since money can be used to improve economic and social infrastructure, which will be increasing employment opportunities. And then calculate terms of trade for 2019, show all calculations. So it will be the index of export prices over index of import price multiplied by 100. So in the case, we gave 1 mark for the formula because we cannot give 2 marks for what we call for an answer. So in this situation, for 191 over 153, you get 1 mark, 1 mark. And then after that, we have an answer 124.8 or 125, which give us 1 mark to give us 4 marks. Then you get your 10 marks for this data response. And then also another data response, that the graph below and answer question that follow. So rand to dollar, the exchange rate. So we see 30 is to 40, the quantity, and then the original demand and original supply. But you can see the depreciation because there's an excess demand there. If you see the demand increase more than the supply remains constant, there is a depreciation. We're paying 15 rand 20 to afford a single dollar. Now we are paying 15 rand 50. Let's check. Name one exchange rate system that can be used. Manage or control floating exchange rate, Remember, that one is when the government intervened by setting minimum and maximum limits, but the currency can appreciate and depreciate because of market forces. Free floating exchange rate, that is the one whereby there is no intervention by the government or Reserve Bank, but the currency can appreciate and depreciate without limit because of demand and supply. And then a fixed exchange rate system, that's when the exchange rate remains pegged by the state to maybe not be changing for the given period of time. And then let's check again another question. Give one reason for the shift in demand curve above. So increased payments for import of goods from USA, increased payments of services from South Africa, increased spending of South African tourists, South Africa buying shares from USA, high interest and dividend pay to USA investors in South Africa, high loan repayments of loans from USA. Any other correct answer and relevantly is accepted. And then we continue. Briefly describe the term foreign exchange. The foreign exchange. So foreign exchange is the conversion of one country's currency into another currency. Explain the value of the rand against the dollar after the shift in the demand curve in the graph above. The rand has decreased its value against US dollar. The rand has depreciated against the dollar. How can the appreciation of the currency be negative in the economy? If the currency appreciates, how can that be negative? The currency appreciation may increase export expenses. And then when the currency appreciates, the number of commodities exported from that country decreases, because now that will mean, when the currency appreciates, the number of commodities exported from that country will be decreasing because of the decrease in foreign demand. This situation drastically causes a decrease in the GDP for the country. And then another data response here. So here you are given two graphs. So impact of tourism on the rand and dollar. So here you have diagram A and diagram B. So the supply originally D1 and D2. So we have over-assessed here. So in diagram B, we have S1 and S2, meaning there is a decline in supply here, there is an increase in demand. So let's simply check on question, who manages exchange rate policies in South Africa Central Bank? There is the answer. And then which diagram above represent an increase in the number of tourists from USA? The diagram A briefly describe the term exchange rate control. Foreign exchange control governs the measures taken by the South African Reserve Bank regarding the purchase of the currency. Restrictions applied by some governments to ban or limit the sale or purchase of foreign currencies by nationals, and or the sale of purchase of the local currencies. Any other correct relevant response is accepted. And then how can the South African Reserve Bank correct an undervalued currency? When the currency is undervalued, interest rates can be decreased to cause an overflow of foreign currency and drain excess liquidity from the economy and release the inflation pressure. And then explain the impact on the rand if the number of tourists from South Africa to USA decrease. Use the information on the diagram to prove your answer. So you must use the graph. A decrease in the number of tourists from South Africa to USA will cause a decrease in the demand for dollars. Therefore, USA will decrease the supply of dollars to South Africa. The decrease in number of tourists will shift the supply curve from S1 to S2. Then consequently, the equilibrium quantity of the dollar will reduce from 16 to 12. Then the initial exchange rate was 16 rand at the quantity, and then $16. But the decrease in the demand for the dollar increased the value of the dollar to 17 rand at the quantity to the quantity 12 for the dollar. So the exchange rate will rise as the rand depreciates against the US dollar. So these are 8 marks question. Differentiate between free floating exchange rate and and the fixed exchange rate. So we compare the first two, free floating market forces only, the fixed the government only or Reserve Bank. So let's check now. Free floating exchange rate. It is the exchange rate system where equilibrium exchange rate is determined by market forces, demand and supply without any intervention by the state. Exchange rate fluctuates as the market condition change. And then this system generally works automatically. Then free floating exchange rate can appreciate and depreciate without limits. So 4 marks normally is provided here for the first explanation because you are differentiating. And then we check again now the fixed exchange rate for another 4 marks. we check a fixed exchange rate remains, it means the value of the currency is fixed or pegged at a certain level by the state. So the exchange rate is not influenced by market forces. Its value is determined by the state or the government. Authorities can devaluate or revaluate the currency. It cannot appreciate and depreciate. Remember, the fixed exchange rate cannot appreciate or depreciate, but it can revaluate or devaluate. Normally, that is done by the government or authorities. 4 marks is provided in there, then that gives you 8 marks. So note the following. If you are differentiating, it is very important that when you provide your difference, you draw the table so that when you say free floating exchange rate is exchange rate system that can appreciate and depreciate without limits, whereas a fixed exchange rate is the exchange rate system that cannot appreciate and depreciate, but it can only revaluate or devaluate. The free floating exchange rate value is determined by market forces, demand and supply. And then the fixed exchange, whereas fixed exchange rate is not determined by market forces, demand and supply, but it's determined by the government or authorities. So it is important for you to be technical as you differentiate. Ensure that the first point is equivalent to the second point so that they make sense together. Do not mix your points because they won't be giving the difference. They will just be descriptions. Okay, discussion questions. How can the deficit on the current account affect the economy of South Africa? Let's check. A current account deficit may mean the country is not producing its own goods, rather relies on imports. This will result to decline in economic growth. And then a deficit on current account may also mean that local firms cannot compete with import, therefore leading to decline in production, shutting down local firms and loss of jobs in South Africa. And then also we continue with the same question. A rising current account deficit leads to an increase in supply of the nation's currency in the foreign exchange markets. Then if a current account deficit is financed through borrowings, it is said to be more unsustainable because remember, borrowings are only the short-term solution. This is because borrowings is unsustainable in the long term, and countries will be burdened with high interest rate to be paid in the long term. If ever we borrow to finance our exports, that will simply mean as interest rate increase because of what we call it, as interest rate increase that we have to pay, there will be more burden on the country. As our currency depreciates, loan repayments will also be increasing, which will be a burden to the country. A very high balance of payments deficit may at some point cause a loss of confidence by foreign investors. Maximum of 2 for maximum of 2 for examples or mere listing, and 8 marks is allocated. Make sure that you have 4 sentences in full that are correct to obtain 8 marks. This is the higher order question. So it is important that whenever you list facts or you provide examples, be aware that you will be obtaining only maximum of 2 marks. We claim the whole thing for 2 marks if we are listing, but if you discuss in full sentences, you can get maximum of marks. And then we have the test that will be written on Friday next week. So I will be quick on this one. What should you focus on? So I will be bringing you exam guideline. Remember, when I started by working on what we call working on the circular flow, I indicated on the exam guideline that it is important for you to know what we call the following, the concept based on the what we call circular flow, which is the definition for the circular flow: closed economy, open economy, participants in the circular flow. What is their importance? How can they contribute on building the economy? And then how does financial market interact with participants in the circular flow? It is very important for you also to know the interaction between all of these participants, and then know the difference between real flow and money flow and their components, and then show the relationship between financial sector and what we call and participants in the circular flow. And then also equations for injections and leakages. It is important for you to know that whenever we have leakages being equal to the injections, we have economic equilibrium. So J equal to I plus G plus X, that's a formula for injections. L equal to S plus T plus M, that's a formula for what we call leakages. Brief explanation of an economic equilibrium where Y equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Relate aggregate spending consumption to income. Explain the concept autonomous consumption and marginal propensity to consume. You need to know all of these concepts as you are focusing, as you are revising. So when you revise, for effective revision, use your exam guideline to check your efficiency. And then we continue. Market. It is very important for you to know this one as an essay. Discuss in detail the market in the circular flow within the 4-sector model. Remember, you have your factor market, product market, foreign exchange market, and the financial market. Be able to discuss them in detail for 26 marks, and then also be flexible for additional part that can come anywhere within your circular flow, what we call questions as a part of the higher order. And then link the operation of financial market and foreign exchange markets to participants of the circular flow. So you must be able to link how does financial market and what we call and the foreign exchange market link with what we call with the participants in the economy. We know that financial market acts as a mediator between participants because it provides financial resources. Also, we know that all foreign exchange markets activities are done in financial markets. So for our consumers to import and export, they need to interact with the foreign exchange market, which is found through the banking system or financial sector within the economy. So you need to know, be able to discuss in detail this, what we call this, these markets in detail. Then national account aggregates. It is important for you to know relevant concepts that are relating to the national account, where we talk about three methods of calculating GDP: income method, expenditure, and the production. Also, the concepts in there, we have compensation for employees that you must know how to describe or define. Net operating surplus, and then we also have consumption on fixed capital. Also know GDP at factor cost, GDP at the basic price, taxes on production, subsidies on production, taxes on products, subsidies on products, GDP at the market price, and then also gross national income. You need to know those concepts. They are very important for you. Also, gross domestic expenditure is also important for you to be able to define. Residual item is also important. Those are the relevant concepts that are important for you to capture, to understand national accounts. So know the table forms for these accounts, namely production method, income method, and expenditure, so that you can be able to also to answer in data response questions. Know also how to discuss and the importance of production method for 8 marks questions. Analyze, interpret, and derive the aggregates. Know how you can convert GDP at factor cost. You know that we have compensation for employees plus net operating surplus plus consumption on fixed capital. That's a conversion for GDP at factor cost. Then GDP at the basic price. You are aware that you need to take GDP at factor cost plus using income method, taxes on production minus subsidies on production. You get your GDP at the basic price. GDP at the market price. You take your GDP at the basic price plus taxes on products minus subsidies on products. And then what we call gross national income. You take your GDP at the market price plus primary income from the rest of the world minus primary income to the rest of the world. Those are your conversion that you must understand and remember. Using the production method, you know if you want to convert gross value added, you say primary sector plus secondary sector plus tertiary sector, you get your gross value added. How to convert that to the market price? You take the gross value added plus taxes on products minus subsidies on products. You get your what you call market price. Using expenditure method, you say C plus I plus G. Final consumption spending by the household plus consumption spending by the investment spending by businesses plus government spending. Plus or minus residual item, you get your gross domestic expenditure. How can you convert GDE to market price? You say gross domestic expenditure plus payment for exports minus payment for imports. You get your what you call GDP at the market price. So it is important that you are able to do that, be able to do conversions. So national account conversions, analyze the national account conversions based on factor cost, basic price, market prices, taxes and subsidy on production, and then tax and subsidies on products. Convert GDP to what we call GDP and GNP, and then be able to explain the S&A according to exam guideline, the system of national account as it was assessed on your previous project or SPA. Then we have our multiplier that is very important for you to be able to discuss. That's why you have to know multiplier concept, multiplier process, and then calculation of the multiplier. And then also you must be able to calculate the multiplier using 3 ways, which can be the 3 formulas where we say K equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC, or K equal to 1 over MPS, or K equal to change in income over change in the injection. Given the graph, be able to interpret and answer questions, be able to draw the graph on your own. Also, that is important. so that you can obtain marks on your multiplier questions. Then we have business cycling. So here it is important that you know the composition of the business cycling. So a basic concept, the nature of the business cycling, the typical and the actual business cycling or real business cycling. You must be able to give the difference between the two phases of the business cycle as for resurgent, depression, recovery and prosperity. On a brief discussion, be able to distinguish between both resurgent, depression, recovery and prosperity. Know what is happening on resurgent, that is not happening on recovery or prosperity. And then be able to explain real business cycle with the drawing or illustration. Know that that business cycle is having jagged waves, not smooth waves. And then discuss or be able to discuss or distinguish monetary's view on the business cycle and what we call exogenous explanations. And then be able to discuss Keynesian view on the business cycle, which is known as endogenous explanations. Then compare both endogenous and exogenous explanation of the business cycle. Then be able to explain types of the business cycle based on number of years and the nature of investment. Where we talk about the juggler, the kitchen, goosenet on contractive, we can add the likes of the political business cycle. And then after that, we can also talk about the demand-driven business cycle and the supply-driven business cycle. And then we continue. Know the government policy with the intervention of the state to smoothen the business cycle, where they use fiscal policy that include taxes and government expenditure, monetary policy, interest rate or repo rate, open market transaction, cash reserves, as well as moral suasion. Be able to smooth the business cycle. When the economy is at peak, how can you implement fiscal policy and monetary policy instruments? When the economy is at trough, how can you implement fiscal policy and the monetary policy? Remember, at peak we implement contractionary policies. At trough we implement expansionary policies because we want the economy to recover. And then be able to discuss in detail the new economic paradigm using both the demand side policies and supply side policies. That's when on the demand side, you talk about the likes of the monetary policy and fiscal policy in both expansionary way and contractionary way. You talk about both also unemployment and inflation. Unemployment and inflation, where you will be using Phillips curve also to explain. Also on the supply side, you explain supply side policies on how aggregate supply can be stimulated in the economy. That's when you discuss reducing cost of doing the business, improving efficiency of inputs, and improving efficiency of markets. So it is important that we are able to draw both the demand side and supply side policies graphs. There's a graph that indicates the demand side policy is only being influenced, which will be causing inflation effect. There's also a graph that will be indicating the deflation or the decrease in inflation whenever the supply side is influenced alone without influencing the demand side. There's also one graph that shows the combination of both demand side and supply side policies on the paradigm, where there will be no inflation effect, but the change in demand and supply with the same quantities. And then also you work on in detail discussing the features underpinning forecasting. Remember, if we say discuss in detail, that's your essay. So this is one of the essays also where we discuss features underpinning forecasting. That's when you deal with the likes of indicators, LCC, leading indicators, lagging indicators, coincidence and composite indicators. Be able to describe them all and then give some examples. And then we go further to talk about the length of the business cycle, amplitude, the trend line, extrapolation, moving averages. So you must be able to discuss all of these in this kind of an essay. Also, for the sake of maybe section B, they can come in whereby you must be able then to indicate on the graph the length of the business cycle, indicate on the graph the amplitude of the business cycle. And then on the public sector, that's when now you have to be able to discuss the likes of I think we started with the wrong slide here. First, we start with the necessity of the public sector, where we discuss the importance of the public sector in the economy. Then we go further to discuss the public sector objectives. After that, we discuss the also reasons for poor public sector provisioning. Remember, public sector objectives are your essay. It will be saying discuss in detail public sector objectives or macroeconomic objectives. Then we go further to broadly outline various budgets, where we talk about national budget, provincial budget, and local budget. And then we differentiate between MTEF and MTBPS, medium-term expenditure framework, as well as medium-term budget policy statement. And then also analyze the main budget taxes, sources of income allocation, as well as personal income tax table, where we will be having the table provided to you in terms of income tax bracket. Explain how socio-economic rights are embedded in the budget of the South African government. And then that's a fiscal policy. Be able to discuss fiscal policy in terms of we have variations and features or characteristics, and then also effects of the fiscal policy, using also incentives and disincentives, and also be able to draw the Laffer curve in there and explain it. Then foreign exchange markets, that's when now you deal with what we have just covered. In case it comes in, then know the reasons for foreign trade, in both the demand and supply reasons for the foreign trade. So in that situation, here we go. This is an essay discussing detailed demand and supply reasons for the foreign trade, and then also briefly discuss effect of the foreign trade. This is just the 8 marks or data response question, or maybe listing in the specialization, mass production, efficiency, and globalization. And then also we check balance of payments. You must know your BOP from current account to the capital transfer account, and then you go further to the financial account. Know all components, know how to calculate on the on the current account, because that's where we deal with calculation the most according to the exam guideline. And then also we check, this is the current account provided to you. We have done this before. And then this capital transfer account, and then that is the financial account also provided to you. You must know all components in there so that you can simply know what is listed, what is recorded under direct investment, portfolio investment, other investments, etc. And then we talk about also correcting BOP disequilibrium. That's when we have your interest rate, import control, borrowings and lending, change in demand, export promotion, substitution, as well as change in exchange rate. You must know this one. They can be for 8 marks, or they can be data response, or they can say mention any two, or they can say define one of them in your data response. And then foreign exchange market, that was covered today. It is important to know the foreign exchange control, and then factors influencing the demand and influencing the supply, and then also exchange rate equilibrium. You must know the intervention by the state, undervalued and overvalued currency. How can we correct that? And then exchange rate systems also are important for you. Fixed exchange rate, free floating, and control floating exchange rate. And then terms of trade are important. You must know them, be able to define, be able to calculate terms of trade, know the effect of terms of trade within the economy, know how appreciation can affect terms of trade, and know how depreciation can also affect terms of trade. Then our lesson was mainly about the terms of trade, that is believed to be the index of export prices to the index of export prices. And then foreign exchange market, we spoke about in the types of exchange rate system that are used in the world and the one that is used in South Africa. And then we spoke about the appreciation of the currency as well as the depreciation. We spoke about overvalued currency and undervalued currency, the intervention through devaluation and revaluation of the currency to ensure that the currency is stable enough to promote economic activities in the country. So for that reason, please check the preview for the next lesson on Just in Time next week, 14 March 2025, at 2 o'clock to 15:30. Macroeconomic review. We will be reviewing macroeconomic lessons that we have covered before. Then we will be starting protectionism and free trade topic, which is then our part of economic pursuit. We are following the exam guideline. After all, I, Mr. Mhlongo, thank you, and I believe this lesson will be a greater incentive as you prepare for your upcoming control test next week. Good luck for next week, and all the best.